In the summer of 1977, New York City stood simultaneously as the most powerful and the most fragile city in the United States. Its skyline dominated the horizon of the Western world. Its theaters, museums, and universities attracted the brightest minds on the planet. Wall Street moved fortunes that determined the fate of entire economies. But beneath that grandeur, the city had been accumulating a crisis that had grown silently over more than a decade. A municipal debt of billions of dollars, closed factories, abandoned neighborhoods, a police force reduced to a third of what it had once been, and a population that had lost faith in the institutions that were supposed to protect it. On the night of July 13th, a summer storm advanced through the Hudson Valley. At 9:34 in the evening, the first lightning bolt struck the transmission lines feeding power into the city. In 25 minutes, in a cascade of technical failures that the engineers of Consolidated Edison desperately tried to contain, New York was plunged into darkness. 8 million people lost power at the same time. And in the hours that followed, what happened on the streets of the city was not caused by the blackout. It was revealed by it. In 1977, New York had become simultaneously the most admired and the most abandoned city in the United States. The crisis consuming it had begun in the 1960s, when the large factories that had employed generations of New Yorkers began to close or migrate to southern states where labor was cheaper. The Bronx, which had been one of the most productive industrial neighborhoods in the country, lost more than 60% of its manufacturing jobs between 1960 and 1977. The same happened in parts of Brooklyn and Queens. The families that had the financial means left the city without thinking twice, moving to the suburbs of New Jersey, Connecticut, and Long Island, and taking with them the tax base that sustained the city's services. What remained behind were those who had nowhere to go. Black and Latino communities that had arrived in New York in previous decades, attracted by the industrial jobs that no longer existed, confined to neighborhoods that disinvestment had transformed into zones of progressive abandonment. In the South Bronx, property owners who could no longer pay the taxes on properties that were worth less and less each year made a decision that would become the symbol of an entire era, hiring people to set fire to their own buildings and collecting the insurance money in return. Between 1971 and 1977, more than 30,000 buildings were burned or abandoned in the Bronx, and entire neighborhoods that had housed working families for decades were transformed into fields of rubble where only the brick walls of destroyed buildings still stood. New York City Hall tried to maintain services while the tax base shrank, borrowing to cover deficits that grew each year. In 1975, the city was technically bankrupt, unable to pay its debts or finance its own basic services. The federal government refused financial aid at first, a decision that President Gerald Ford defended publicly by announcing he would veto any bill providing a bailout for the city. The Daily News tabloid responded with one of the most famous headlines in the history of American journalism: "Ford to City, drop dead," a phrase Ford never actually said, but one that captured with brutal precision how millions of New Yorkers felt about the federal abandonment of their city. The agreement that avoided formal bankruptcy required deep cuts in everything. New York's police force was reduced from more than 31,000 officers to fewer than 22,000, and firefighters saw their units cut in the very neighborhoods where fires were most frequent. Schools closed units, hospitals reduced beds, and parks were gradually abandoned. The streets of the city's poorest neighborhoods, without sufficient policing, without economic prospects, and without the slightest confidence that the authorities cared about what happened there, were becoming territories where the law functioned only in theory. It was in this city, tense, impoverished, and on the edge of collapse, that the July 1977 storm descended. A city that had lost 1 million inhabitants, that had buried its neighborhoods in rubble, and that had seen its own federal government turn its back on it, still faced one of the worst nights in its history. On the night of July 13th, 1977, a summer storm was advancing through the Hudson Valley toward the city. At 9:34 in the evening, a lightning bolt struck two high-voltage transmission lines in Buchanan, Westchester County, disconnecting them from the grid. The engineers of Consolidated Edison, the company responsible for supplying electricity to New York, activated the contingency systems and believed for a few minutes that the situation was under control. But it was not. 40 minutes later, a second lightning bolt struck another transmission line in Fishkill, at a moment when the grid was already operating at maximum stress because of the summer heat and the intensive use of air conditioning across the metropolitan region. Consolidated Edison began losing control of the grid in a cascade of failures that its own protection systems accelerated rather than contained, automatically disconnecting circuit after circuit in an attempt to protect the equipment that ended up depriving the entire city of power. At 11 o'clock at night, New York was in darkness. The first minutes were of total disorientation. In Manhattan restaurants, waiters lit candles, and customers continued dining without fully understanding what had happened. In the subways, trains stopped abruptly in tunnels, and passengers were trapped in the dark between stations, some for hours, sweating in the stifling heat of carriages without ventilation. In hospitals, emergency generators came online covering intensive care units and operating rooms, but leaving corridors and regular wards plunged in darkness. At traffic lights that had gone dark across the major avenues, traffic collapsed immediately, with drivers honking and crossings blocked across the entire length of Manhattan Island. At JFK and LaGuardia airports, flights were diverted or canceled because the air traffic control systems depended on grid power, and the emergency generators did not cover all the necessary equipment. Thousands of passengers were stranded in the terminals in partial darkness, without clear information about when flights would resume. In the elevators of Manhattan skyscrapers, hundreds of people were trapped between floors and had to be rescued manually by firefighters throughout the night, work that consumed resources the city would urgently need elsewhere in those hours. But it was in the neighborhoods of the Bronx, Harlem, Brooklyn, and Queens that the blackout took on a completely different dimension. In these neighborhoods, where trust in institutions had been destroyed by years of abandonment, and where an entire generation had grown up without real economic prospects, the darkness was not received as a temporary inconvenience. It was received as an opportunity. The first looting began less than 30 minutes after the lights went out. In Crown Heights, Brooklyn, a crowd broke down the doors of a clothing store at 11:20 in the evening. In Bushwick, also in Brooklyn, what began with a few people breaking into a single shop transformed within minutes into a situation in which entire blocks of commercial establishments were being simultaneously emptied by hundreds of people. In the Bronx, where the years of arson had already left entire neighborhoods in ruins, new fires were set that night, some deliberately to cover the looting, others for reasons that were never completely explained. Mayor Abraham Beame was woken with news of the blackout shortly after 11 at night, and arrived at the city's emergency operations center to find that the police were being rapidly overwhelmed by what was happening in the streets. He asked Governor Hugh Carey to activate the National Guard. The request was denied. The National Guard, argued the governor's office, would take hours to mobilize and equip, and its presence in the streets could escalate the situation rather than contain it. The New York City Police Department would face that night alone. By midnight, New York had transformed into a city its own inhabitants barely recognized. In Manhattan, where tourists and theatergoers had received the blackout as a curious novelty in the first hours, the atmosphere had changed completely. The candles in the restaurants were blown out and establishments closed in haste. The streets that would normally have remained lively until late emptied rapidly as New Yorkers understood that something far more serious was happening beyond the simple absence of light. Luxury shops on Fifth Avenue placed employees at their doors. Hotels locked their entrances and directed guests to remain in their rooms. The wealthier part of the city closed in on itself and waited. In the neighborhoods of the Bronx, Harlem, and Brooklyn, the night was following a completely different course. In Bushwick, which would become the most enduring symbol of that night, Broadway, the neighborhood's main commercial artery, was taken over by crowds that broke into one shop after another, completely emptying each establishment before moving on to the next. Butchers, pharmacies, bakeries, furniture stores, establishments that had served the community for decades, were completely looted within minutes. When there was nothing left to take, some buildings were set on fire. By dawn, more than 300 commercial establishments in Bushwick had been destroyed, looted, or burned. And the neighborhood that was already poor would wake the following day even more destroyed than it had been the evening before. The scenes unfolding in the streets in those early hours were of a chaos that no emergency plan had anticipated. In Harlem, families living on the upper floors of buildings without working elevators descended the stairs in complete darkness, carrying children in their arms, trying to escape buildings that were catching fire on the lower floors, while firefighters struggled to arrive through streets blocked by crowds and abandoned vehicles. At intersections without traffic signals, cars came from all directions at the same time with no order whatsoever, drivers honking and shouting at each other in the darkness, creating gridlocks stretching for kilometers in every direction that blocked the passage of emergency vehicles trying to respond to calls coming in without stop. The police tried to act, but were completely overwhelmed by the scale of what was happening. On the streets where looting was most intense, teams of 2 or 3 officers arrived to find dozens or hundreds of people involved, without enough personnel to make mass arrests, without putting the officers themselves at risk. In some cases, they advanced, detained whoever they could reach, and fell back while the crowd continued. In others, they simply cordoned off the perimeter and watched, waiting for reinforcements that were slow to arrive because they were being demanded at other points across the city at the same time. Throughout the night, as reinforcements arrived neighborhood by neighborhood, arrests accumulated into the thousands. But the structure of New York's criminal justice system was not prepared to absorb that volume in such a short time. Precinct cells filled within hours, and officers began detaining suspects in corridors, internal courtyards, and any available space within the facilities. Duty judges were summoned in the early hours to process the most urgent cases, but the volume was so great that many of the accused would spend more than 24 hours detained before being formally charged. By the end of the blackout, 3,815 people had been arrested in a single night, the largest number of arrests in a single event in the history of New York City. Firefighters worked without stop throughout the early hours, responding to calls that kept coming in even after the sun began to rise. In parts of the Bronx and Brooklyn, the sky in the early hours was lit by the orange glow of multiple fires burning simultaneously at different points in the same neighborhood. A scene that photographers and cameramen recorded in images that would be published in newspapers around the world in the days that followed. 1,706 fires were registered that night across the city, a number the New York City Fire Department had never faced in a 24-hour period in its entire history. Teams arriving to fight one fire were redirected to another before even finishing the first. And in many cases, buildings simply burned to the ground without anyone managing to intervene in time. Hospitals operated in emergency mode throughout the night. In addition to the victims of fires and confrontations with the police, emergency rooms received an unusual volume of patients with cuts from glass broken during the looting, elderly people collapsing from extreme heat without ventilation, and people who had suffered accidents on dark streets without working signals. The doctors and nurses on duty worked with emergency lighting and generators that sometimes failed, knowing that outside the city was still burning and that new victims would arrive before the previous ones had been attended to. The city's communication systems were operating at their absolute limit. The emergency number was receiving calls at a rate of several per second at the most intense moments, and the operators trying to prioritize the most serious incidents barely managed to process each piece of information before new calls arrived. The police radio systems, overloaded with simultaneous transmissions from dozens of units spread across the entire city, made it impossible for commanders at the operations center to know clearly what was happening and where. New York had been designed to function with electric light, with traffic signals, with digital communications, and with infrastructure that presupposed constant power. Without it, the systems that kept the city running proved far more fragile than any emergency planning had anticipated. At 3 in the morning, with looting still underway in several neighborhoods and fires still burning at multiple points across the city, Mayor Abraham Beame gave an emergency press conference in which he described what was happening as an act of savagery and demanded that Consolidated Edison restore power as quickly as possible. The company, whose engineers had been working since the start of the blackout to reconnect the circuits one by one, estimated that full restoration would take at least until the following day. It was one of the longest nights in the history of New York, and it was not over yet. Power began to be restored gradually throughout the day of July 14th, neighborhood by neighborhood, circuit by circuit, as the engineers of Consolidated Edison reconnected the grid in a process that took more than 25 hours from the start of the blackout. When the lights came back on, what they illuminated was a city that had changed during the night in a way that no restoration of electricity could undo. In Bushwick, Broadway looked like a war zone. Smashed shop fronts, doors torn from their hinges, pavements covered in broken glass, and merchandise scattered around that had not been taken because it was too heavy or because there was no longer space to carry it. The owners who arrived at their shops that morning found establishments completely empty, with the walls still standing but nothing inside. No merchandise, no equipment, no cash register, not even the shelves, which in many cases had also been torn out and taken. Many of these owners were immigrants who had built their businesses over decades of work and who did not have enough insurance to cover what had been lost in that single night. Some never reopened. In the Bronx, where the early morning fires were still smoldering at several points when the sun rose, firefighting crews continued working to extinguish the last outbreaks, while residents tried to understand the extent of what had happened in their own neighborhoods during the hours they had been trapped indoors. Buildings that had survived the years of crisis and abandonment that had characterized the South Bronx in the 1970s had not survived that night. Families who had lost their apartments in the fires were taken to emergency shelters set up by the city in school gymnasiums and community centers, adding one more chapter to a history of displacement that the Bronx already knew very well. The images that reached newspapers and television broadcasters on that July 14th shocked the country and the world. Not only the images of the looting and the fires, but the scale and geographic distribution of what had happened, which made it clear that the blackout had functioned as a key that simultaneously unlocked in dozens of different neighborhoods a pressure that had been accumulating for years. The editorials of American newspapers in the days that followed furiously debated the causes of what had happened, divided between those who described the looting as pure criminality with no possible justification, and those who argued that a night of chaos could not be separated from a decade of deliberate abandonment of the city's poorest neighborhoods. Mayor Abraham Beame declared that the city would punish with the full force of the law everyone involved in the looting and the fires. Governor Hugh Carey visited the most affected neighborhoods and promised aid for reconstruction. President Jimmy Carter visited the Bronx in October of that same year, walking through the streets of a neighborhood that had been partially destroyed by the fires of previous years and that the blackout had damaged even further. A visit that produced one of the most iconic images of the American urban crisis of the 1970s. The President of the United States standing in the middle of a field of rubble in the heart of the largest city in the country. Consolidated Edison was the target of lawsuits and government investigations that concluded the company had made operational errors in managing the crisis and that its contingency systems were inadequate for an event of the magnitude of what had occurred. The company paid compensation and was required to invest in improvements to the power transmission infrastructure. But no compensation and no investment in infrastructure could rebuild the destroyed businesses, restore to the communities the stability that had taken decades to build or erase from the collective memory of the city what had happened that night. The blackout of 1977 did not destroy New York. The city survived, recovered, and in the following decades underwent a profound transformation. But that night left a permanent mark on the way the United States thinks about cities and about what happens when decades of accumulated inequality find the right moment to explode. The looting did not begin when the lights went out. It began years earlier, when the factories closed, when the jobs disappeared, when the neighborhoods were abandoned, and when the federal government told the largest city in the country to fend for itself. The blackout lasted 25 hours. What it revealed had been built over an entire generation. And New York, which survived that night, would take decades to fully understand what that darkness had illuminated. Comment down below where you're watching this from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. A big hug, and until the next reconstruction.